Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson House. My name is Elizabeth Karcher. I'm the executive director, and it's my pleasure to have you come and interview and do a talk about the Woodrow Wilson House. We are in a Whitey Butler wood designed house. It was started in 1915 and completed in 1916. Whitey Butler Wood was an incredible architect who had three distinct phases of building and architecture, starting with very small residential with partners in Washington, D.C., up to the Department of the Interior is one of his final buildings. This house happens to be a great example of one of his residential property. And the thing about hidden Washington is that you can go into the Department of the Interior, you can go into the Museum of Women in the Arts, that's another building. You can go into some of his public buildings, but you can't go into his private residences because they're owned by people. So unless you see and follow the real estate pages and do a search for Whitey Butler Wood, you won't see a house unless one of those houses go on the market. And I have to say, I am guilty. I do have a search. When a Whitey Butler Wood house comes on the market in Washington, D.C., I go see it because I am really fascinated by this architecture and where it fits in that compendium of time of Whitey Butler Wood designed houses. The design is Georgian Revival. It is one of the things that's quite elegant about the building is a sense of balance and a sense of light. We're in this space that part of the house is really underground or built into the side of a hill, and yet it's extraordinarily bright and extraordinarily light. The house has three main rooms on this floor: the solarium, library, a drawing room, and the dining room. And then on the third floor it has 4 bedrooms. And then on the fourth floor were the laundry room, and where the family that worked and lived in the house for the Wilsons, that was their bedroom, their accommodations were up there, their bathroom and their quarters. A portion, almost half of the property, is the backyard, and the backyard is also an integral part of the design of this house. It hasn't been touched and in terms of changing the design. It's a sunken garden, which at the time was really seen as an extension of the living space, an extension of the living room. Edith Wilson, when it was coming to the end of Woodrow Wilson's second term in office, Edith Wilson and Woodrow Wilson decided that they would retire to Washington, D.C. Edith apparently went home went back to the White House to say that she'd bought this property or that she liked this property. And he said, "Don't worry, and I don't need to hear any more about it." And he gave her a piece of some soil and the key to the house. And that was a Scottish tradition to give soil from the property, and gave her the key to the house and said, "This house is where we'll be moving to when we leave the White House." So they moved in on Inauguration Day, which in 1921 was March 4th. But we've got great photographs of moving day for the Wilsons and all of their belongings on the front stoop of the house. And moving day, even for a retired president, is just like moving day for anybody else. All of your things are kind of strewn out on the front lawn. Interestingly, there are some items there, and it tells you, when you look at the pictures, it is a clue to how things worked 100 years ago. A number of pictures are in barrels of things, and they would use barrels because it was an easy way to roll, to move things. So you would see these barrels, which of course there's no barrels in the house, but that was part of the way people would move belongings 100 years ago. people talk about what Edith's motivations were and what kind of woman she was. She saw caring for her husband as a priority. She was Mrs. Woodrow Wilson above anything else. One of the reasons that she chose this house is that she had heard, which is true, it had a trunk lift. The Fairbanks had put in a trunk lift to hoist their trunks when they would arrive for the season, to hoist those trunks up to the 3rd floor where the bedrooms are. And Edith very cleverly thought, well, we could take that trunk lift and convert it to be an elevator. So from the time they bought the house in February of 1921 to the time they moved in on March 4th, Otis Elevator Company came in and installed an elevator. The elevator is unusual in that it is what we call a bird's nest. It has the gates that go on, that close like this, that kind of like you've seen in Paris buildings, but it opens on 2 sides. On some floors it opens on the west side, and on some floors it opens on the north side. And that, for 100 years ago, was an unusual design. There's some people who are really big fans of elevators in the world, and Otis Elevator Company has obviously found them, and some people come specifically to see the elevator. It had been on the line for the Massachusetts Avenue trolley at one time, and so we have the electric pole that what I've been told is that at one point there was an electrical circuit break, and that the Wilson elevators stopped the trolley on Massachusetts Avenue. Edith Wilson is, she's really remarkable. She was born in Wytheville, Virginia. Wytheville is in the foothills, Appalachia. She was very proud of being a descendant of Pocahontas. She's from the original families of that area of Virginia. She's a Bowling, and the Bowlings, and at that time even, the families had crests, and so she has a Bowling crest. It's unusual because she only had 2 years of formal education. She had brothers and sisters, and really any money was spent was actually to educate her brothers. She was educated by her invalid grandmother, and part of her job was to take care of 26 birds. There is a sense of this. She's indomitable. She made her way, and she made her way to Washington, D.C. to visit a cousin right after she'd finished school. She very shortly thereafter met a man named Mr. Galt, who was part of the Galt Jewelry Company, along with his brothers, which was a very, very well-known and established jewelry company. But you don't get the sense of too much passion in that marriage. Why do I say that? When she wrote her memoir, she only dedicates maybe 2 pages, not even to Mr. Galt, and she dedicates a lot more to Woodrow Wilson. I mean, the whole book is basically on Woodrow Wilson, although it is her entire life memoir. They were married after 12 years. He died quite suddenly, surprisingly. And now she's a widow in Washington, D.C., which gives her a lot of freedom. She inherits this jewelry company, which she's not a businesswoman. As I said, she has 2 years of formal education. So the thought that she goes to take over this business is really something. But she was smart enough to realize that there were people that she needed and figure out to learn the business, and she does. She meets the president towards the end of his first term. His first wife had died, Ellen. She had moved to Washington with the president and their 3 daughters. There were, as I like to say, 3 weddings and a funeral. 2 of the daughters got married at the White House, and then his wife, Ellen, dies, and the president is quite bereft. It really, somewhat of a recluse for a couple of months. His doctor would take him out for walks apparently, he spied Edith and said, "My goodness, who's that beautiful woman?" And the doctor thought, I should figure this out because this is the first sign of life the president's had in months. So Carrie Grayson, Dr. Grayson, and the president were golfing, and Helen Bones and Edith Galt were out taking a walk, and both sets were traipsing through the mud, and they met each other in a corridor in the White House, kind of bumping into each other, looking at how messy their clothes were and apologizing, but they sat for tea, and she was invited back the next day and the next and the next and the next. They dated, you're president, so what does that really mean? She said she felt things were moving a little too quickly, and also he was going to be running for re-election. And there's a war, and there are race relations, and they are picketers for suffragists outside the White House every day. It was not an easy time. And one of the things I love about studying Wilson and his presidency is the challenges that he faced are challenges that presidents face today. Those themes resonate today. So when Wilson and Edith moved into the house, he had had a stroke. He'd been president, and one of the challenges that Edith faced was that people called it a petticoat presidency, that she was actually running the show. And there's going to be a book coming out this spring that is reevaluating Edith's place in that running the presidency or not. She would tell you in her memoir, in her record, she would say that she is a steward of the president, a steward of the presidency, but she is Mrs. Woodrow Wilson first. She wasn't making decisions, or she decided on what papers she would bring to the president for his review. She really saw herself as a caregiver. And one of the ways that I look at it is when she moved into this house, the two things that she did were build the elevator for the president, and then also build the garage for their cars. Wilson loved to be driven around. Interestingly, she knew how to drive an electric car, and he didn't know how to drive a car. And yet, he knew how to ride a bicycle, and she didn't know how to ride a bicycle, and he taught her in the basement of the White House, where I believe she crashed into a box of china, and henceforth they moved the china to the blue room. At the time, people felt that people who had strokes should have everything very similar. We really shouldn't shock the mind or the brain. It should be as similar as possible. To that end, she had a replica of the Lincoln bed made so that he would sleep in that bed here in the Wilson house, so that it would be similar. The bedroom is laid out the same way that the bedroom that he slept in the White House was laid out. It brings a smile to my face because I love the story of Mary Scott. Mary Scott is married to Isaac Scott. They are the couple that move into the house with the Wilsons for moving day. In fact, Isaac Scott was probably brought in earlier to help get the garage and the driveway built, as well as working with Edith's brother to oversee getting the elevator put in. So Isaac Scott works at Galt Jewelry. His job was to be a runner. Obviously, that's a trustworthy job. Edith knew him well and respected him and trusted him and invited him to come to work in the S Street house upon their retiring from the White House. She also invites his wife, Mary, to be the cook and housekeeper and to oversee the housekeeping of the house. That means that she was in charge of the meals and the laundry. That doesn't mean she was doing the laundry. She would hire out people to do the jobs that needed to be done, whether it was catering for events but this was Mary's domain. And there was a photograph of Mary, and she's just so proud and dignified in that photograph. I just find that, I love that. I just love it. Isaac Scott is extraordinarily dutiful. You see many pictures of Wilson in this house, and Scott's by his side. He would be his personal valet, whether that meant helping him shave in the morning or dressing, serving his breakfast. The house at the time was designed to be very formal, and Wilson himself would have spent most time right in this room, having his breakfast in the solarium. In the morning after that, he would go down to the main level and kind of have a meeting in the morning with his secretary, who was actually Edith's brother. They say also that he did his exercise in the front foyer. So he would do his exercises and then go to the dugout to have his an early morning meeting. And then he would spend a good part of his day in the library, which is, some of our guests refer to it as the old school man cave, because he didn't have to get formally dressed to be in his own library. When Edith Wilson bequeathed the house to the National Trust for Historic Preservation, it was with the understanding that it would be to discuss and educate on the legacy of President Woodrow Wilson. That legacy has changed. That legacy, in the 1960s, he was still seen as one of the best presidents that the United States had ever had. And that has changed, because as we are educating ourselves about race and the challenges that presidents faced and how they dealt with them, we're learning that maybe he had decisions and policies that he made that were really quite consequential for the next century. And those in particular were allowing the federal government to become segregated. We have a room, the drawing room, that is filled with gifts of state from around the world. And these countries are, even still today, people from different countries come because they are honoring Woodrow Wilson, what he did and stood for their country. Armenia, the Czech Republic, these are countries that say, you know, were not for Woodrow Wilson, we wouldn't have a country, we wouldn't be a country. So how do you take a person like Wilson, who has this vision of world peace and has this vision of self-determination and self-actualization for people all over, that people should be able to be free to join their tribes, their clans, their clusters, their groups, their families, and yet segregate his own government, and yet have this racial discrimination for his own people in his own country. And that's a very hard topic to grapple with. And so it's not that we want to change it or even understand it, but hopefully learn something at least about ourselves when we come to a historic house like this. DC, well, the way Washington is laid out, it is 4 quadrants. And even still, there's a big divide from one quadrant to the next in terms of race and class and types of workers who are living in one neighborhood and another. Kalorama, interestingly, when they bought this house, this was not all embassies. This was not yet Embassy Row. Embassies came to Washington and into this section and a lot of these residences as a result of the stock market crash. That's when Americans lost their money and foreigners were able to come in and buy the houses. And so that's when really this area became truly Embassy Row. These were all wealthy industrialists who lived in this neighborhood, not necessarily ambassadors. One of the beautiful things about the house is that it's only had 3 owners. It had the Fairbanks and then the Wilsons, who were here. Mrs. Wilson was here until 1961 and her death. And she bequeathed it to the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And of course, their mission is to preserve it. So it is really untouched. It is a gem of a property that has been untouched in 100 years. Well, I can just say that we've got different tours. So we have our general tour, which we offer on the weekends. And of course, if you call and you want a general tour, we'll give you the general tour. And then we have these specialty tours that people come back for. The specialty tours are, as I mentioned, the upstairs, downstairs, under one roof, an architecture tour. So let me see, I'll get them in order. Architecture, under one roof, 3 generations of Wilson women, a tour specifically, and it's really a talk about the ceramics and the china and the crystal that belong to the Wilsons. A curator's tour, executive director's tour, and we will soon be coming out with a prohibition tour.